Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. On any list of the men who made New York City, you are sure to find certain names. Explorers and early governors like Henry Hudson and Peter Stuyvesant. Merchants and industrialists like John Jacob Astor and Cornelius Vanderbilt. Financiers like J.P. Morgan. Builders like John Roebling and Robert Moses. Politicians like Teddy Roosevelt and Fiorello LaGuardia. And inventors like Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. But who are the women who helped build this great and unique city? Journalist Julie Scelfo has culled through hundreds of names and come up with an assortment of women who in their own ways helped make New York the unique place it is today. She celebrates them in her book, The Women Who Made New York, with portraits by Hallie Heald. It's just been published by Seal Press. Welcome.
Hi.
So what was the impetus for this book?
You know, it was actually an idea of the editor of Seal Press. She realized that there had been a great book called Rad American Women A to Z that celebrated awesome women, you know, from the letter A to the letter Z with beautiful illustrations, and that there seemed to be a lot of interest in books about New York, but that no one had ever written about the women who made New York. So initially we thought we would pick a list of just 25 women, but as I began researching, I realized there was no way that we could sort of limit the list to that few number of women because there were so many more who had made such a dramatic impact.
I mentioned some of the ways, the men, when we talk about the men who made New York, there's a focus on capitalists, industrialists, financiers, politicians, builders. Did the women who made New York City contribute in the same way as men or in different ways?
I love that question. You know, one of the hardest parts in doing this book was figuring out what New York City is, and I had to come up with some way to define it. And there were a lot of things about New York City that were very obvious and sort of iconic, like Broadway or Wall Street, Harlem, different periods in New York City history when the immigrants, you know, the various waves of immigrants that came in. But I also was really interested in the arts and culture, and I thought about food, which is such a big part of New York. So I just kept amassing as many women that I could find who had done something influential in New York City, and then I tried to sort of take it apart and identify what those contributions were. So women, just like men, contributed to building New York, designing New York, but also there were some other categories, I would say, where women took an even greater ship role, like in education and in public health.
And you did say that you felt women were instrumental in building nearly all of the social justice movements that came about in the city. So that was really an area that they staked out for themselves.
Absolutely. You know, there were important New York women that I thought of whose influence on New York wasn't so great. For example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Sonia Sotomayor. Nobody would argue that these women have been tremendously influential, and they're both daughters of New York City. But their influence was really on the country as a whole and not on the shape of New York City in particular. Other women who created social justice movements or who created activism or who worked to sort of affect social change, they were doing it in New York City, but those changes spread out to the rest of the country. So for example, Gloria Steinem's in the book, and her feminism really started when she attended the meeting of a group called the Red Stockings, and she heard women talking openly about abortion and other health issues that affect them, and she realized, you know, why doesn't everybody talk about this? So her work sort of began in New York City, but obviously the feminism that she championed really spread out to the rest of the country, and it was like that in other social justice movements as well, especially, for example, if you think about labor rights. You know, this was where Rose Schneiderman, at 13 years old, had to go to work in a factory after her father died. There were 4 children in the family. They couldn't afford to eat. And while she was working in the factory, she began seeing a lot of abuses. And she talked to other young women who worked in the factory and was so upset that they were getting paid so much less than their male counterparts. And she began organizing workers and advocated some of the biggest labor strikes that took place. Unfortunately, after one of them, one of the companies that refused to agree to some worker safety requests that had been made was the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. And 2 years later, the fire happened happened there where so many people died, especially young women. I think 146 people total, 129 of them were girls. And so the fight continued for labor rights, and that's when Frances Perkins became involved and was appointed commissioner of an investigative committee to look into that fire. And the stringent labor requirements that were developed in New York, she brought with her to Washington and became sort of the bedrock of national labor policies and behind the New Deal. And
became the first secretary, first woman cabinet member, Secretary of Labor.
That's right.
A lot of your choices are women that we have heard of. For instance, Emily Warren Roebling, at least I'd heard of her, the wife of John Roebling, who directed the completion of the Brooklyn Bridge after her husband, the chief architect and engineer, became ill. Lillian Wall, who we know as, I guess, one of the first real social workers, certainly social reformers, who created the Henry Street Settlement. Now, you mentioned Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who certainly led the first women's rights movements. But why in a book about women who made New York City? I mean, were they that connected with the city?
They were. When I began researching different periods in New York history, I hadn't realized it, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton had to move to New York City when her husband got a federal appointment. And Susan B. Anthony joined her here, and it was down on was called Newspaper Row across from City Hall that they began printing their newspaper that advocated for suffrage for women. And a lot of their major meetings to discuss suffrage took place in New York. And also that sort of spirit of human rights and dignity, I think, is a big part of what we think about when we talk about New York values. So many people come to New York to celebrate what makes them unique or individual. And also, I think it's historically a place where there's a lot of openness towards all the different types of ways we express ourselves in the human culture. And so I think that sort of championing of human rights and of women's dignity is a big part of New York City's identity as well. So I decided to include them.
Okay. Margaret Sanger seemed like an obvious choice.
Yes, well, Margaret Sanger's sort of, life-changing moment took place when she was working as a nurse and was called to attend at the bedside of a woman who was dying in a tenement. And this was a mom of 2 young children who had earlier pled with the doctor to give her information about birth control. They were terribly poor. They could barely afford to feed their children, and she physically was not someone who felt she could handle another child. And she had gotten pregnant and had given herself, attempted an abortion. It made her very sick, and she had recovered, and that's why she asked the doctor for birth control. And unfortunately, he said, "I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to give you that information." Comstock law at the time prevented doctors from discussing contraception. So she attempted another abortion, and unfortunately, that was unsuccessful, and she also damaged herself internally, and she was lying in bed bleeding to death in front of her husband and children and Margaret Sanger. And she left that night, and Margaret Sanger was one of 11 children, and her mother had died young after so much childbirth, and she walked the streets of the city saying, "What can I do?" And she made a vow to herself then and there, or that's how she told the story, that she would spend the rest of her life working to help other women to not have to go through this. And she opened her very first clinic in New York City, where she provided information and supplies for contraception. She also began publishing pamphlets about contraception and also about women's health, like how to protect yourself against STDs, which at the time, again, were not allowed to be discussed by medical professionals because of the Comstock law.
And she basically was essentially led to the creation of Planned Parenthood.
Absolutely. She founded some early organizations that are now what we call Planned Parenthood.
Emma Lazarus, whose poem is, I guess it's on the base of the Statue of Liberty.
Absolutely, but you know, I hadn't even realized she wrote the poem years before when a group in New York was doing a fundraising campaign to pay for the pedestal to put the statue on. And I also hadn't really realized, but it was Emma Lazarus's idea that the Statue of Liberty would stand for a welcome spot for refugees. It was her idea that the United States and New York City in particular should have open arms for refugees. She had spent time volunteering at one of the intake sites and had met all of these Russian refugees who had experienced the pogroms, and she was horrified and couldn't believe sort of the experiences people were having abroad. And so she wanted Lady Liberty to stand for more than just sort of a thank you gift from the French, which is what it was intended for. And I reference in the book this beautiful letter she received from another poet who said, you know, it's your words actually who have given this sculpture, the statue, meaning even more than the statue itself. And I thought that was amazing.
You talk about Nellie Bly, who was an investigative reporter who went undercover to reveal conditions on, it was Blackwell Island in New York City. You talked about Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to operate a brokerage firm on Wall Street, and who also ran for president and advocated on behalf of women's financial and sexual freedom. I am really amazed when you look at people like Nellie Bly and Victoria Woodhull that they were able to accomplish what they did, to do what they did at that time. And this was a time before women could even vote, and before most women even could find jobs or held jobs.
I have a friend, I'm going to plug somebody else's book. I have a friend coming out with a book next year about what she calls onlyness. And it's about people who have something in them that makes them really unique and they're really like no one else. And over again, I saw that quality in the women featured in this book, because these women just had incredible fortitude and they weren't really looking left or right or backwards. They just did what they needed to do or what they wanted to do, and they accomplished so much. And there were so many women in the city's history, and I think the hardest part for me in doing this book was leaving women out. I spent a lot of time sort of laying awake at night going, oh my gosh, how can I not include this person? How can I not include that person? And Louise Mirror at the New York Historical Society is the one who helped me finally sleep again at night. And she said, look, no one museum exhibit can cover all of human history, and there's no way one book is going to do that either. So you have to just enjoy who you're going to get to celebrate. And happily, the New York Historical Society announced that they're going to open this year the first center for the study of women's history. So there's going to be an entire floor of that museum that's devoted to women's history, and a lot of the women in the book are going to be there too.
In New York women's history?
New York women's history. So we get to learn more about, Nellie Bly lived in this, in what was called an insane asylum and endured incredible torture, just so that other people could learn about it, and that was the beginning of we as a society understanding that people with mental illness maybe are acting out not because of their illness, but because how they're being treated.
Yeah.
So a lot of what these New York women did, I think, has helped us understand humanity and the importance of human rights. And luckily, hopefully, those lessons, I think, are traveling beyond New York as well.
We're going to take a short break. Then we'll be back with more with Julie Scelfo, author of The Women Who Made New York, after this message. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Julie Scelfo, author of The Women Who Made New York. It features short biographies of these women, portraits by Hallie Heald, and has just been published by Seal Press. What was most fascinating to me was learning about, some of the women who are lesser known. I mean, some of whom I'd never heard of. Barbara Giddings, a gay rights activist. Tell me a little bit about her.
Barbara Giddings grew up in Philadelphia and knew from the time she was a very young girl that she was homosexual. And she wanted some information about it, but also knew that it was something that she just couldn't talk about in her home. So she would go to the library and she would look for information, and there was almost none available. And it wasn't until after college that she came up to New York City and met other lesbians in the East Village. And eventually she began what was the New York chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis, a San Francisco group, and they published a newsletter for lesbians that was distributed around the country. And this document in the 1950s and 60s was so important to women because when you lived in a small town and you didn't know anyone else like you, this was for many women a life-saving thing to be able to hear from other lesbians. And the tone of the publication was sort of apologetic and helped. It gave advice to help women who were gay sort of hide in their community. And Barbara Giddings had the idea, especially after reading a very influential book at the time, that gays should be proud of their rights, proud of who they were, and assert themselves as a group for their rights. So she began organizing protests to assert the value of homosexuals just like any other person.
And she also was very instrumental in trying to get the American Psychological Association to declassify lesbianism as a mental illness.
That's right, because what had happened was they had classified it in the DSM, which is the Manual of All Mental Disorders. Homosexuality was seen as a disorder. And she said, well, where's the scientific proof of that? If we know there have been homosexuals for all of human history, on what basis are you saying it's a disorder? And through a lot of advocacy and work, she was eventually able to get it overturned. And I thought, that's a pretty important thing. And I, too, had never heard of her.
Hetty Green, a wealthy investor in the late 19th and early 20th century, who actually lent money to the city to bail it out of hard times.
Hetty Green should have been called the Oracle of Wall Street, but because she was a woman and because she wore a black dress, which is something she did after her husband passed away, the men on Wall Street nicknamed her the Witch of Wall Street. And this mean nickname, appeared all over. And they despised her. But when you look at the numbers and what she achieved, she had grown up with a father who's an investor who had poor eyesight. From the time she was 6 years old, he would ask her to read the daily papers, read the commodities reports. And by the time she was a young woman and inherited a little bit of his money, she was one of the best investors in the world and died one of the wealthiest people in the entire world. So New York City appreciated that, and when they had problems, she would privately lend them money. But she was pretty miserly, and that was true. She didn't spend a lot of money. She preferred to rent rather than buy a home so she wouldn't have to pay tax on it. Mm-hmm. But she was phenomenally talented, and it was interesting. I was writing it during the Hillary Clinton campaign, and I began noticing the similarities throughout history. When there was a woman, that men didn't like, she would be called a witch or other things that rhyme with that. And you saw this again and again and again, and certainly in the case of Hetty Green.
Right. Elizabeth Milbank Anderson actually built a public bath for the poor back in 1904.
She lost a son to diphtheria and was heartbroken. And so she had this money from her family. I think her father's family had owned the Board and Milk Company. And she met these women who were involved in public health and sort of good works in the city. And she said, what can I do that would be most beneficial? And she said, these other activists said, what poor people in the city need is hygiene. They need a place to take a bath, to wash their clothes, and so she built a bathhouse, and this became one of the very few early bathhouses in the city and became a model for others. And then she went on to donate the money that enabled Barnard to get started, and she purchased the blocks surrounding the original Milbank building, which she also paid for, and she did it anonymously and then deeded the property to Barnard so that it would have a campus. And in all of her works, she was never sort of interested in being recognized. She didn't put her name on any buildings. Instead, she called it the she used the name Milbank, which was her family's name. And even today, the Milbank Foundation continues to fund all kinds of important public health work. And her grandson, who I had the pleasure of meeting, is working on a book about her life. And he found very interesting documents from her life about the money that she spent on her homes at the time compared to sort of other wealthy people. You know, she had a lot of wealth and she lived very well, but she also decided the best use of her money was to help other people.
Mm-hmm. Ella Baker. Now, I'd heard of Ella Baker, and I knew she was involved with the civil rights movement. But why someone who helped make New York City?
Well, Ella Baker, when I read about her, first of all, I was horrified and outraged that I didn't know about her before. I had not heard her name, or if somehow I managed to miss it in all the years of what I thought was a very good education, it really is a tragedy, because Ella Baker is basically the mother of the civil rights movement, and she is important to New York because she moved to Harlem after graduating from college, and she went to work in a newspaper where she met some of the leading intellectuals at the time and became very involved in the movement in Harlem to help blacks feel empowered. And she ran what was essentially a buying co-op, which was an idea that someone had to help blacks understand their own economic power by pooling their resources and buying things in greater quantities. And she was so good at organizing, she was hired by the WPA to work in New York, and then she went to work for the NAACP and traveled throughout the country building that organization, which was also based in New York. And so Ella Baker was involved with three of the most important civil rights movements of the 20th century, civil rights organizations: the NAACP, Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Convention, and also SNCC, which was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And somehow we all know about these organizations, but we didn't know about Ella. And the achievement of Harlem and blacks who had come from all over the United States and the world sort of realizing their own identity and power is something she was a big part of.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talked about some of the women crooks of the city. We don't have a lot of time to talk about them, but there was Polly Adler, who was the West Side Madam, ran a brothel that flourished.
Very successful brothel.
And then we have Frederica Mandelbaum, who was a crime boss, Stephanie St. Clair, who headed her own numbers operation in Harlem and stood up to Dutch Schultz. Didn't know about those. Were there any women you discovered who just sort of blew you away when you came across them?
Criminals or otherwise?
You know,
Stephanie St. Clair is mind-blowing. And, you know, this was a woman who was looking to build her life and provide for her family. And there weren't so many opportunities for blacks at the time in Harlem or elsewhere. And so that is one reason that people turned to crime. And running a numbers ring, you know, was essentially like a gambling ring. And it was crime in the sense that they weren't paying taxes on it to the city. But they did provide all kinds of neighborhood services. So they would actually build parks and have fairs and even help out individuals who needed loans. And she not only sort of helped her Harlem community, but when the gangsters who operated in lower Manhattan and the bootleggers began to understand the amount of wealth that was in Harlem and tried to sort of intrude on that space and brought some of their violence up there, which Stephanie St. Clair had managed to never need in the way she ran her business, she stood up to them and they backed down. And it's an incredible story that really, it's amazing it's been overlooked.
What do you want people to take away from your book?
You know, there's several things I hope people take away from the book. And one is that we began to appreciate how much of our history as women and as Americans and as New Yorkers has been lost. You know, the women that I found that I was able to include are amazing, but it gives you a sense that it's just the tip of the iceberg of the histories that were not recorded. There's an organization in Park Slope called the Lesbian Her Story Archives, and they have carefully been trying to retain the history of women for a very long time that is often overlooked or ignored in mainstream places. And so I hope we begin to appreciate that. And I also hope we begin to honor our foremothers the same way we honor our forefathers, because without them and without their contributions, there's no way New York City would be the same place. And finally, I also want people to I also wanted to make something that reflected the New York City that I know and love, which is culturally diverse. It's rich in diversity of personality, and you know, the sort of whitewashed images that we get in certain popular culture, television shows or mainstream films really do a disservice because they don't reflect the vibrancy and the beauty that exists here. So I hope people fall in love with New York City the way I have.
You certainly say in your book that New York City is a place of transformation, a place where people are able to find themselves or reinvent themselves. And I think that that is something that a lot of these women were able to do.
Absolutely, and they reinvented the city for us so that we could come here and make our own way.
Okay. We're out of time. I want to thank Julie Scelfo for joining me today.
My pleasure.
The Women Who Made New York has just been published by Seal Press. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.